been developing all the plans and hearing all the community input and getting there. So tonight, this is we're in our second round of feedback on the Streetscape project, and Brad is going to be presenting to you two concepts that he's developed. You have the handout that he's going to walk through, but before that, he's actually going to start with comparing and contrasting the two, so you have that as an overview. And then, depending on how things are going, we can also launch and go into block by block, which is what these handouts are, going through each block in detail. And we'll play it by ear, and we have the board set up outside too, so that we can actually also at some point break up and go outside and talk in more smaller conversations if that's what you'd like to do too. So with that, I will turn it over to Brad, and just want to thank you all for coming.
All right, great. Thanks, Kristen. Just wanted to dive in and talk about some of the broad overview, some of the background stuff, the stuff that we've been presenting in June. I won't spend too much time on it, but just kind of it's a good sort of refresher point or point of reference for it, and sort of lets people know that maybe haven't been involved with the process this far. But when we came back to council in April here, we were sort of talking about the sort of have to do and nice to do list, that there's a series of things that we have to do that are going to be done sort of no matter what, and those are really ADA improvements, looking at drainage and stormwater improvements and roadway repaving, and then sort of the big bucket of things that were these nice to do items, which were things that we'd like to try to include in the plans. We wanted to make sure that we were talking to people, getting consensus and seeing what people thought really were important to include within the streetscape plan. So we had a whole list of these nice to do's, and we'll just kind of run through that. For the public outreach meetings, we had a series of outreach meetings in June with BSAC, DMVA, TPAC, the business and property owners. We did a community outreach meeting here in June, and we were really doing a lot of listening and just talking about what kinds of things may go into the streetscape plan, and doing surveys and collecting data on that. We'll talk about some of the findings that we ended up collecting from some of the initial feedback we were receiving. And then coming back in July, we ended up having a touch base with the council where we were beginning to present these two options to see if there were any fatal flaws. And then we're taking it back to the same boards and back out to the community to get input on these and really see, is there anything in the plans that people don't like, things in option B you'd like to see in option A, things that, are not in here that need to be in here. And then we'll be going back to the City Council on September 18th with kind of a preferred Phase 1 plan, as well as a large addendum and kind of the long-term vision for this. Where do we actually want this to be in the end? And the idea with this Phase 1 construction is that we'd like to actually start doing construction in January through May of this year. So there's going to be some sort of Phase 1 that'll be an early kind of construction phase. So knowing that we need to be able to work toward that January construction date, and we'll really be looking at what that is and presenting that in the council in September. Project goals, just kind of as a refresher, we were looking at improving walkability and the pedestrian experience. Look at how can we actually use the streetscape to support the outdoor business, shopping, and dining experience, making the businesses really successful throughout the corridor. Also looking at enhancing the community character and thinking, that the streetscape really is kind of a major impression in the thing that a lot of people see that are coming to Del Mar for the first time or tourists, and thinking about, what is the community character, what's going to make people want to linger and stay and actually sort of, become of interest to pedestrians and people visiting and coming to the corridor. And then also look at improving pedestrian and bicycle safety as another sort of significant goal of the project as well. We also had heard from a lot of people, we've been looking at this for 20 years. Our firm actually had worked on the 1996 Streetscape plan, and we just wanted to go back and look at it and say, what are the things that we've already been talking about, or were we talking about in 1996? So we've kind of highlighted just the things that were, talked about in 1996 that we're still looking at here today. So a lot of this stuff really isn't new, and, you guys really have been talking about this for 20 years. So we just want to make sure that things that we've been talking about in 96 are still valid. There's also new things that weren't really around in new regulations and codes. So those are some of the other things we've been looking at as a part of the streetscape plan update. And then we were seeing some things we wanted to revisit, like the removal of the left turn lanes at 11th and 13th Street. So that's one item we'll talk in more detail about. And it's something we hadn't talked a lot about in our June outreach, but something we want to at least discuss tonight and see, is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Should we look at a hybrid scheme that maybe removes some? And I'll dive into that in more detail later. And we wanted to talk a little bit about sort of what's the summary of the community outreach. And the good thing is we did hear a lot of consensus on a lot of the issues when we were doing our June outreach. Pretty much all of the have to do's, everybody was behind and supporting. And I'm going to not read off of these because we'll go into each one of these because these have all made it into the concept plan if they were a general consensus item. And then a lot of the nice to do items, you can see there's just a whole list of things here. And again, we'll go through these sort of one by one. And these were all things that people were really sort of saying that they wanted to see in a plan, and items that we tried to include in both option A and option B, or concept A and B, when we dive into those. There were a few items, though, that didn't necessarily have consensus support from the nice to do list. And things, or some of these were things that we brought up later, including these nice, the nice to do thing up here is the removal of the left turn pockets. We had presented these the last couple of meetings, and people were thinking that it was a good idea to try to remove some of the left turn pockets, but no one could agree or come to a consensus on which locations they may want to do that. So, if it's sort of a split decision, we really want to sort of talk more about that. Is that anything that people support? Is it a bad idea? Just get some feedback, so we'll dive into detail on that. Also looking at alternative vehicle parking, whether that be motorcycle, scooter, micro vehicle, and even bike rental parking, were things that there was not a general consensus or sort of approval on. And thinking that, should we look for adding parking spaces for these alternative vehicles, and knowing that it's part of the climate action plan. If there are leftover spaces, as long as we're not removing parking, for designated parking spaces. So those are some ideas and things that we want to get some feedback and talk a little bit more about. And then there were a host of other things that we had actually heard during our outreach that weren't things that were on our radar, but just comments that we heard from the general public. And a lot of them were really sort of the first thing had to do with traffic calming, and especially sort of vehicular speeds, especially coming in from 9th Street. And as we were looking at sort of mid-block crossings at 10th and the one that exists at 12, and the potential for people to either run stop signs or miss people in the mid-block crossings, and thinking, what are our options to actually potentially help alert people that they're entering a pedestrian zone, you need to slow down, the speed limit's changing. And some ideas that came up were rumble strips. People were talking about adding stop signs, not saying that those are good ideas, and there's been some TPAC and the Sustainability Advisory Board has kind of spoken out against that, but these were just ideas that came up quite frequently and were discussed. As we're looking at sort of raised pedestrian crosswalks, the idea that you'd actually require the crosswalk to be raised and cars would travel up and over that. We've kind of heard from the transportation engineer that may not be allowed on Camino del Mar, but it did bring us up to thinking about, would you actually change the paving material at crosswalks so that it's brick or a different type of concrete, or it could be some sort of decorative mural or something that sort of highlights that, hey, there's a pedestrian crossing here, I need to slow down, there's something going on. Sustainability was another thing that we heard a lot about. Are we using LED efficient lighting? And the answer to that is yes. Are we dark sky compliant? Are we looking at porous paving and permeable materials? Are we selecting plant materials that are drought tolerant and low water use? And also looking at selecting plants that do carbon sequestration and are really sort of providing environmental good. And so we've really been serious about trying to make sure that we're including all these features, and we'll be able to talk about all these sustainable features that we've included in the plans, but try to be really sustainable with what we're doing. Back and diagonal parking was another thing that had come up for people were wanting to discuss, and we wanted to just talk about that as well too. Do people think it's appropriate to do back and diagonal parking? We've got a photo of that as well if people aren't familiar with it, and it's recently been installed up at North Beach at Dog Beach, and it seems like people are starting to get more familiar with it. It's something that people are doing, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then sharrows versus bike lanes was another thing we heard a lot about, but just to kind of talk about that was something that for those of you not familiar, a sharrow is when a bike actually shares the lane with a car, as opposed to having a dedicated bike lane separate from the travel lanes. And as we talked to council early on, it was determined that some of the controversial items such as roundabouts, sharrows, and travel lane reduction were items that we weren't going to consider as a part of the Streetscape plan. So it is something that we weren't looking at as a part of this plan. And so we really want to dive into the things that are the two concept plans. We've taken all these have-to-dos and nice-to-dos and come up with this chart and used it to really develop these two plans. There's a concept A and a concept B. The concept A is really what we consider a more modest kind of improvement. It really leaves most of the existing curbs in their current locations, but tries to implement or actually include in the plans as many of these nice-to-do and have-to-do items as we've really been hearing that people are interested in including. And then looking at concept B, it's sort of this includes everything that people really said that they wanted to hear. And there are some things that make it very, very difficult to include all these in sort of a phase one plan that we may need to look at policy changes. There may need to be sort of approvals by council. There's a lot of coordination that may need to happen with adjacent property owners. So we're kind of looking at those as potentially longer term improvements that could happen, but maybe not as part of phase one. But still thinking we want to be very visionary on this and making sure that we are getting the needs and desires that everybody want, but then also looking at what might be kind of a interim phase or what might we be able to do in January as well too. And so I'm going to kind of highlight each of these sort of one by one just to let you know, and we have photos that sort of support it. And you can see that there's a a check if it's actually included in concept A or concept B. And you'll see concept B also has some check pluses, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but it means that it also includes it, but it may include some further enhancements, or it may include more of those items. For example, like the drainage improvements and the flow-through planters, that if we start moving around some of the parking spaces and curbs, we actually have more opportunity for planting and more opportunity to collect stormwater, and that's just sort of one example. So pedestrian bulb outs and ADA improvements are kind of the first item. We're making those changes wholesale in either concept A or concept B because it was a have-to-do item. And for those of you not familiar, the bulb outs are the little areas that essentially come out at the street intersections and make it for a safer pedestrian crossing, and also work for traffic calming to slow vehicles down. So those will be included at every single intersection. And a lot of them are actually required to deal with some of the complex grading issues that we get to with the steep slopes and cross slopes. The second items are just to talk about are repaving and restriping of roads, and that's going to be happening throughout the corridor in either scheme, and was part of the have to do. Also, part of the have to do is looking at drainage improvements and flow-through planters. And this is one of the items in concept B where we actually have more of these. So this is just a quick photo that shows you how we actually would be able to take stormwater from the street or the adjacent hills, run them into a planter so that they can actually sort of percolate through the soil, be captured, and then slowly release out so you don't get the big sort of periods or gushes of inundation of stormwater going down. And then it also provides an opportunity for additional planting. You could plant trees in there, which also help sort of absorb and take up more water. And the plan on the right is just starting to show that as we're looking at these, that there's actual opportunity that if we actually start moving the curbs, that we can actually include sort of additional flow-through planters in some of these areas where there's opportunity to gain additional planting here. So that's kind of the plus that you're seeing on B. The next item that we were looking at was pedestrian lighting, and we will be adding pedestrian lighting throughout the corridor in both option A and option B. Option B has kind of a further, or concept B has a further enhancement where we're looking at actually doing a series or a mix of sort of pole lights and bollard lights. And just to show you what that actually looks like, we're talking about putting this lighting sort of every 75 feet on center and eliminating the existing lights that are out there, trying to keep something that's much more pedestrian scale. And we were doing a lot of outreach on what sort of style do people like for the lights. So in terms of option A and option B, we'll be looking at doing some sort of pole light that's kind of the arts and craftsman style. This fixture is actually a similar fixture that was used at the roundabout just down the street here. It's got a different pole, but it seems like it keeps with sort of the theme of that as well too. So we thought it might be nice to try to distinguish the downtown zone in some area while still sort of being true to what else is going on in the city, trying to highlight a little bit of difference. Option B also includes bollard lighting, where we're starting to look at those in sort of key areas like the bulb outs or areas where there are sort of more high density areas of pedestrian traffic. We're also looking at doing banners and flower basket kits, and you can basically buy these and they can go on the side of the actual light poles. And we just want to say that all the lighting here would be LED efficient fixtures and dark sky compliant. They'll have occupancy sensors so that in the middle of the night they're not necessarily lighting up sidewalks where they're not people, but as people are detected by. There's all these smart light things that are required by Title 24 in California anymore. So it's all sort of mandated stuff. And then the other idea that we had been talking about a lot last time was sort of accent lighting and looking at tree down lights, or even actually providing sort of power outlets that, during holidays or special events like Breeders' Cup or whatever, you could potentially do twinkle lights on street trees and sort of try to create some atmospheric forms of lighting that are low-level lighting. So these are things that we're looking at as well, too. We're also looking at adding a continuous sidewalk along both sides of Camino del Mar. There's a couple locations where there really are sort of pinched or sort of limited sidewalks, and we're looking at that. This is at the southwest corner, or actually the northwest corner of 12th Street by Matus. The car almost goes up to the face of the building. There's not really a well-defined sidewalk zone there. And then also at Lemon Tree Corner at 11th Street on the east end, the parking really kind of extends here. There's a wall here, so there's not really continuous sidewalks. And as we're looking at the plans here, we're in both option A and option B, we are trying to sort of work by pushing that parking back in order to create a sidewalk where you can actually walk in front of these areas. So we really are trying to create a continuous sidewalk along both sides of the street with a minimum of 5 feet wide. So we are making adjustments in order to actually achieve that in all of our plans. New planting, irrigation, trees, and landscaping are actually something that we're including in both as well too. We've also been looking at the removal of eucalyptus and a lot of the other sort of unhealthy or smaller trees that aren't necessarily well adapted or aren't doing well. we've had arborists actually look, for example, at the eucalyptus trees in front of the library, and we found disease, rotten crown, rotten roots, roots that are upheaving the sidewalk, and there's plenty of other trees that are problematic throughout the corridor. So looking at eliminating some of those trees that really aren't appropriate for this and replacing them with trees that are a little bit more appropriate will actually give us some of the carbon sequestration that will actually absorb the stormwater. And we've really been looking, there's a really good report that the City of Santa Monica Urban Forestry Department has done that actually starts to quantify a lot of like the benefits of these trees. So we're kind of looking at which trees do a lot of the heavy lifting environmentally and thinking that these are trees that we'll want to look at for the streetscape plan as we're moving forward. And the other thing to just kind of mention with regards to irrigation, we'll actually be putting in high efficiency drip irrigation and looking at doing purple pipe. And for those of you not familiar with a purple pipe, basically is what you use for reclaimed water, and thinking ahead to the future that we know that there's planning to actually bring reclaim to Del Mar someday in the future. And this will sort of avoid any ripping out of that. We can actually just tie right in as soon as reclaimed is available. So I think this is a good opportunity to sort of be a little bit more forward thinking on that. Stuff that you don't really see, but stuff that we're thinking about and we want to make sure we include. And we've actually started, and we've got a board out here that shows this a little bit later, but we're starting to look at zones and what types of street trees we might use, where we might look at planting being a mix of sort of the colorful succulents that you're starting to see the garden club implement. Also looking at flowering, ornamentals, and natives, all still very drought tolerant, but looking at a mix that it's not just succulents, it's not just sort of leafy flowering plants, but it's a nice mix sort of in the garden Del Mar style. And it plays a lot on what the garden club has been doing in Del Mar for years, and including some of the planting that we were looking at for City Hall as well too. So it really seems very regional appropriate and contextual. Also looking at additional site furnishings and benches, lighting, trash, bike parking. There's sort of standards that have been set for the corridor, and looking at that in both Concept A and Concept B. There's more potential in Concept B for some of these items just because we have additional sidewalk zone and the ability to sort of add more space. But these are the sort of standard kit of parts that has been done from 13th to 15th and has been vetted. And we heard a lot of sort of support for if it's already out there, that's not rip out what we've already invested money in, let's keep using it. And then thinking about, are there small scale interventions for opportunities to do artistic or decorative planters or something that we're looking at as well too. And not saying that we have a standard planter, but there's opportunities for sort of smaller scale, pedestrian scale interventions like that as well too. The next three items I'm going to talk about are pedestrian crosswalk safety improvements. One is looking at a mid-block crossing at 10th Street, and we're including that in both options. Concept B includes an enhancement where we're looking at a material change or something that might be a little bit nicer material that might not just be the striping. Also looking at four-way pedestrian crossings at all intersections, and then also looking at adding pedestrian refuge islands in the medians. And just to show some photos of what we're talking about here, looking at adding the mid-block crossing at 10th, in Concept A, we would mimic what's been done at 12th, that we would end up having the push buttons with the lights that flash in front of the road. It would be some sort of striping. Concept B, we're actually looking at, could you do some sort of artistic paving? Would this be brick? Would this be another type of concrete? Could it be sort of an art mural or something, that's a little bit a higher level of enhancement? The four-way crossings were the second item that we were talking about, and currently along Camino Del Mar, if you're trying to cross in the east-west direction, there's only a crossing on one side of the street in all the locations, and thinking that we would just sort of formalize that and make it so that you cross in all four directions for all intersections, and really trying to prioritize the pedestrian. And then the other idea here is looking at adding these pedestrian refuge areas. You can see right now that there's actually small little medians that if you're trying to cross the street, you're walking this way, these people might see you and might not walk, but these people may be going, that this actually provides kind of a safe haven in case people aren't necessarily seeing you. Somebody's blowing a stop sign, it gives you a place to kind of stop and look. And we're able to kind of do this by actually reducing the travel lanes from 11 feet to 10 feet. It actually gets us roughly about a 6-foot wide pedestrian refuge area. And if we look at sort of the elimination of some of the turn pockets, which is a bigger discussion, you can actually get a much wider area up to sort of 13 feet for sort of safe crossing in a wider landscape area. But in all instances, we want to make sure we're providing these refuge areas where we can. Public art's another thing that we're looking at as a part of this. We're not actually looking at including public art in probably the phase one that'll be a part of our plans, but there's a recently adopted art policy, and we want to make sure that we're not sort of stepping on the toes of this recently adopted art policy. And the thoughts are that we've actually been looking, we've got a board on sort of potential art locations and what types of art we might want to start to include, whether that be sculpture or decorative paving, or looking at murals on utility boxes or art walls that you can actually do mosaic tiles on walls. And saying that they would actually use this art policy that's in place to designate a committee to start working through what the art would be. If we were trying to design the art as a part of the process, we'd really want to make sure we're doing the outreach and due diligence. But thinking this would be something that would come at the very end of the phase one, and if we can actually get something in place, there might be opportunities in phase one to actually start including some of the decorative crosswalks or some of these other pieces. But the nice thing is they can actually be sort of broken off as individual projects that happen as sort of art projects or art budget. There's sort of a variety of ways to sort of think about that. And just to jump to this is actually starting to look at the plan, and we have the board that shows this in a little bit more detail, looking at the decorative crosswalks, the idea of painting utility boxes that are out there, looking at sculpture that might be more object versus things that might actually be utilitarian, that sculpture could be benches or seating. Also looking at the art walls, and even thinking about enhanced paving, or you might be able to do mosaic tile on bollards or planters or other sort of things that are out there that need a little bit of a refreshing. The scramble crosswalk at 15th is something that came up and was supported as well too. And for those of you not familiar with the scramble crosswalk, it's essentially crossing where all the vehicles stop, and then there's a pedestrian signal that comes on for all directions, and pedestrians are allowed to basically cross the intersection. Cross the intersection in any direction that they want to sort of move. And we're looking at this in option B as a longer-term plan. There, as we were talking about why we weren't including in option A, TPAC had some concerns about if we have a dedicated signal for pedestrians, it may slow traffic down. You may get more stacking and queuing of cars, especially during the peak times, and it may also lead to more carbon output and emission output as these cars are stacking as well too. So the Sustainability Advisory Board really wanted some more research and some more information on what the effects of this would be. If we all had electric cars, that would reduce that, but it wouldn't necessarily reduce the traffic problem. So it's kind of out for discussion still, and we'd like to hear what people think about the scramble crosswalk. The next item that was an option or a concept B thing is the utilization of this opportunity zones at town and country parking, and this is a little bit more of a complex topic. And the reason that this is in option B and not concept A is that it will require some negotiations with the adjacent property owners, and may also require some policy changes, since the town and country parking is in the city's municipal code. And just as kind of a refresher for what this is just an example here at the corner of 12th near Matus, that the town and country parking is parking that occurs both on private property and in public property. You can see the right-of-way line, property line actually cuts kind of right through the middle of this. And thinking that if we actually, and there's in a lot of these cases this kind of a wide undefined zone behind the cars that a lot of people don't really know. You can see a person walking here. Is it a sidewalk? Is it parking? Is it a travel lane? How is it kind of used? And thinking, could we actually take the parking that's here, push it back to here so that the parking actually goes into this undefined zone, and then we could recapture this kind of whole area that is being used for parking to make a wider sidewalk, additional planting, cafe seating, parklets. And it just so happens that Cafe Secret is actually right back here. You can see the trees in the background, and they actually were one of the properties that did this, where they had parking up against the building. And this was a recommendation out of the 1996 Streetscape plan. They saw that, moved their parking back, and their parking actually is in this sort of undefined zone in order to gain that cafe seating. So this is something that we would definitely like to look at including long term, and it really had sort of unanimous support during our June outreach. So, but probably is a longer term thing that'll take a lot of negotiation with the adjacent property owners. But really is we've dubbed it the opportunity zone because we think it really is sort of the biggest opportunity to make a major impact along the corridor. The next item we're just talking about is looking at providing a themed and consistent primary and accent paving patterns. And this really is talking a lot about, there's a lot of materials that are out on Camino del Mar right now in terms of types of paving, from brick to pavers to 3 or 4 different kinds of concrete, and thinking, okay, let's maybe try to standardize it somewhat. Not saying that we want it to be consistent throughout the whole entire length of the corridor, but let's pick kind of a primary paving. And that would be what we're looking at for that, is the exposed aggregate paving, and people seem to like that primarily. Where there are a few people that spoke out against it, but it does a really good job of hiding stains and gum and other things like that, because it's multicolored. It's got a lot of texture to it. We were looking at some of the other areas where there's standard gray paving that's a really smooth finish, and it shows a lot of wear and tear on it. But then thinking what kind of accents pavings might be more appropriate to highlight bulb outs or cafe seating zones or other areas that are special areas where you want people to sort of linger or hang out out and thinking that, flagstone or brick or concrete pavers or other sort of earthy materials that really kind of highlight these would be a nice thing to use and actually provide some varied interest along the street corridor. And this is something we've been coordinating with the downtown design guidelines that are taking place right now as well too. And it's something that they've been looking at as well too. So there's a lot of sort of synergy between the design guidelines that are being developed and what we're looking at here as a part of the streetscape plan. The relocation of the left turn pocket, so this is, you've heard me allude to it or talk a little bit about it, and we're looking at it in terms of concept A, if it ends up being more of a short-term plan or sort of the more modest plan, we wouldn't say that we would relocate it, but concept B, we've been looking at, what might that look like if you started to relocate these left turn lanes or left turn pockets. And we're not talking about removing the left turn movement, but I know it's a little hard to see here, but the sort of three options here where we either do nothing and leave them as is. We're looking at an option where you potentially would possibly look at eliminating the southbound only left turn pockets, or maybe just the one at 11th or one at 13th, or the option where you would actually eliminate the left turn pockets in both lanes. And by eliminating the left turn pocket, is what we'd essentially do is you would move any turn lanes over to the through travel lane. You'd still be able to make a left turn. You'd still be able to make a U-turn, and it would make that movement a little bit easier. And we think it may be more appropriate in the southbound turn lanes because the streets that actually connect to the east uphill are not sort of major through streets. The one at the library, for example, at 13th, goes essentially a block before you're sort of pushed either back north or south again. But we want to talk about this and see what people's feelings about this are. Are there any locations where it seems like the turn pockets might not be as useful? Do they all seem like they're really useful? So it's something to talk about. There are a few downfalls or sort of downsides that could happen out of this as well too. That there might be queuing happening in the actual travel lanes from people that would have been in the left turn lane. So during peak times, it may somewhat slow that down. But also knowing that you're not allowed to make left turns right now from 3 to 6 anyway at the peak times. So the impact during the peak times are a little more limited. Although there are still a few people making U-turns from those lanes. But then, answer a quick.
Just curious, roundabouts have become so popular in many places. What's the composition of roundabouts? Can it be much smoother for traffic and so on?
Yeah, there was. It's a good question. Roundabouts were one of the items that were sort of off the table for discussion, and there was Measure. I'm going to get my number wrong. Measure M or Measure N a couple of years ago, where there was a vote that there you go, that didn't pass. It actually looked at some significant sort of changes. So we didn't want to necessarily include that in this project. So it was just off the table for this. And then you can see kind of the 3D views of what's happening here. But even with our lane reduction, we are able to kind of get median refuge areas. The second item I want to talk about is a negative, I guess, as well too, and just something to think about that. I know Dave Drucker has brought up at the city council meeting as well too, and that if we actually eliminate these left turn pockets, and people don't signal and they're in that through lane, that if you're a car in the other direction, you may not see them taking a left turn as well too. So there could be potential conflict there if somebody does sort of take a surprise left turn. So it's kind of a matter of people would need to be signaling and be watching what's really happening in that other lane. So that's another sort of consideration to think about. Next item we're looking at is color striping of the bike lane, and I think we're already getting a lot of feedback that this probably should just happen in concept A and concept B. It was something we hadn't talked about previously, but for those of you aware of it, it's basically just highlighting the bike lane with sort of green striping. You're starting to see that in a few locations. That's already happening, along Camino del Mar as Jimmy Durante here, as you break off of Camino del Mar. And one item that actually a biker at TPAC brought up that we were looking at was, would we actually be able to use some of these really small flexible road pavement devices to actually install that right along the edge of the bike lane to help separate bikes from vehicles? It might sort of let motorists know when they're drifting into the bike lane, but it might also help keep bicyclists away from that travel lane and keep some of the sort of side-by-side action from happening, because there is a little bit of a barrier there, but it wouldn't be enough to sort of cause an accident or cause the cyclist to sort of fall off his bike or anything if they were to hit these, because they are very, very small, and you probably have seen them sometimes when they do road restriping. So that's another idea we wanted to talk about or at least bring up. The micro vehicle, motorcycle, and scooter parking, I think we touched on this a little bit, but just wanted to sort of address it again. Is there any consensus about looking for opportunities to do motorcycle parking or implementing specific areas for sort of micro vehicle parking, or looking at even sort of long-term bike rental opportunities within the streetscape? There might be opportunities for some of the bike rental to happen on the sidewalks if we're actually able to utilize the opportunity zones. So there might be some potential to do that without taking away street parking. But that would require us to be able to sort of all come together and say that yes, we really think that concept B is the concept that we want to look at. But then thinking about the micro vehicles and the motorcycle and scooter really tie into the climate action plan and sort of the goals of looking at alternate vehicles. The last couple of items here, looking at parklets and cafe seating, and this would be saying that we're not actually looking at putting in parklets and additional cafe seating. That's something that would be sort of a business by business or owner by owner thing. But wanting to know, should we actually start looking at policies that would actually allow for parklets or cafe seating zones, or modifications that make it easier to actually add these? And for those of you not familiar with parklets, they're typically areas that are meant to be temporary sort of installations within a parking spot, where somebody may build out one of their parking spots with either seating or game tables or exercise equipment. There's a whole series of things that people are doing with parklets, and it's kind of the idea for this creative space. And usually these are maintained and operated by an adjacent property owner. And so they're sort of the ones that are overseeing this, but there's sort of no policy, in place now to actually allow parklets. And is that something that we should be looking at? There was kind of an overwhelming yes on this when we were talking about it last time, because it's not saying we're building them, and it would still have to go through the process of approval. And then the final thing we're just looking at is actually adding conduit for future EV charging stations. And this is nothing that you would really see. It's essentially just laying a pipe while we're ripping up all the street and sidewalk areas, and saying that, if we ever wanted to run electricity through here to add charging stations or have extra conduit for stuff, that we'd be ready to do that without having to rip everything up again. So it's just being a little bit more forward thinking, or thinking about if we're tearing stuff up, let's think about this and what other things might we want to do for the future or plan for the future. And with that, we have the sort of plan-by-plan comparisons. I've kind of talked a lot about what's in Concept A and what's in Concept B. I can kind of run through this really quickly. I don't want to spend a great deal of time. We can really go up to the boards and talk and answer questions on a lot of them. But what you're starting to see is we've got a color coding here. The gray is asphalt paving. The light brown that you're starting to see is standard gray paving, a whole bunch of different finishes. The brown color that you're starting to see throughout is the exposed aggregate paving. The pinkish rosiest color is actually existing brick or pavers or some sort of other accent paving. The light green are planting areas, and dark green are what we're calling those flow-through planters or those drainage planters. There's none of those existing, but you'll see those in the concept plans. And then we're looking at, what's an existing tree with a dash line, and where might we look at sort of adding new or proposed street trees to this item. And they've been circling and highlighting areas in Concept A and Concept B that are sort of big differences. So you're starting to see we're widening a median here to get a wider refuge area in Concept A, and this is just sort of a weird leftover remnant that wasn't done when they narrowed the street, that there's an actual wider travel lane that we can pull some area out of to actually, you can see it sort of neck down here, that this is really almost like a 14-foot wide travel lane in some area that we can capture back to make a safer crossing for this crosswalk. And then Concept B is really looking at the scramble crossing, and then also looking at, how do we actually highlight the paving with maybe a different material or paving choice as opposed to just doing the striping. So those are kind of the big differences between the two plans. Moving to the next block and looking at the 1300 block, again, you're seeing sort of the pedestrian refuge area, looking at actually redoing the paving and removing the eucalyptus trees in front of the library. One other item we've been looking at here in terms of pedestrian safety that we didn't really talk much about, but wanted to just put out there, that we're looking at actually relocating the bus stop that's currently at Zell's to the north side of the street in front of the library to actually help it serve that public amenity. But it also makes it a little bit safer for pedestrians too, as buses pull up here and are parked. People get out and walk. They're sort of walking out in front of a bus that's really cutting off the visibility from anybody that may be parked here at the stop sign. So thinking from a pedestrian safety standpoint, it makes it a little bit easier if people are walking out behind the bus. You can actually see them coming if they are trying to cross the street. The second thing it does, it makes it a little bit easier for the bus to maneuver out of here. If there are a lot of cars during peak hours stacked up here at the stop sign, the bus has to kind of maneuver its way into those parked vehicles that are sort of slowly working their way through the stop sign, as opposed to here where they can kind of wait for an opening and move. And this actually follows NCTD standards for bus locations. There are a few locations like this too where they actually are on the sort of before the stop signs, but they usually prefer to have them out there. So we want to do some outreach to them to see if they're open or even agreeable to looking at these changes. But yeah.
Is there room for a U-turn if you're going to put the bus right at that corner?
Yeah, there still would be room for the bus because it's actually happening in the parking lane. So it's there's still plenty of room to actually make that U-turn. It would be very, very similar to what they have today, that the bus would just replace the parked cars potentially. Moving on to the next block, again, you're seeing some of the four-way crossings that are occurring in these areas. The other item that we're really looking at here in concept A and concept B that are different are what we show with the sort of removal of the left turn pockets and the wider median. And then again, looking at the sort of material change. This is kind of the first block where we also start to see the opportunity zone come into play. The existing parking as it's here now has sort of this sawtooth area and this, and thinking that we would be keeping that if we're looking at option A, but we may look at redoing the paving in this location. But if we actually in concept B look at pushing that sort of area behind the parking out, we can get a much wider sidewalk and actually do something much different in this space, get additional landscaping or cafe zone or something to that effect. Moving to the 1100 block, the kind of big changes that happen here again, this is a block where the opportunity zone really comes into play on both the east side and the west side. That there's a lot of existing sawtooth parking happening here. This is also where Cafe Secret is, so you saw the photos at Matus, and you can kind of immediately see how much of a wider sidewalk we're able to gain in both areas just by pushing this parking further back. Again, you're seeing sort of the left turn lanes removal and the crosswalk enhancements and the bulb outs that we've been talking about everywhere. And the other thing that's a little bit different here that we haven't talked much about is that there are a few locations where there's driveways that actually intersect the sidewalk. And this is one location where you can see there's the kind of gray areas that are coming here that right now as you're a pedestrian walking on the sidewalk, you have to step down into this driveway and then step back up. We'd actually like to flip that and make it so that the sidewalk is continuous at one elevation and cars actually mount up and over a driveway so that it prioritizes pedestrians over the vehicles just a little bit more common in what you see in sort of downtown or more urban kind of conditions for, prioritizing pedestrians over cars. And then thinking we would do the same thing in option B as well too. And you're starting to see, the indications of where there might be flow-through planters, and there's opportunity for more of these in concept B as well too. Moving to the 10th Street to 11th Street block, again, this is the block that's going to have the Civic Center City Hall building on the west side. So this is showing the improvements that have been vetted as a part of that City Hall and Civic Center project. And looking at where the other kind of major improvement that we're looking at here is, again, that sidewalk that we were showing at Lemon Tree Corner, where we'd actually be pushing the parking back, adding a sidewalk in here, and then looking at some of the bulb outs that we're looking at. These are some of the worst intersections in terms of ease of pedestrian crossing, and thinking that we really will have to do some retaining wall work and some bump out work and bulb out work here in order to make this crossing in the north-south direction pretty safe, because there are steep cross slopes that are really coming downhill on both these streets. And then looking from 9th Street to 10th Street, this area is kind of characterized by it's much more open, and you really do see a lot of sort of, traffic really coming through here. But knowing that there's a lot of adjacent development proposed or development potential for these areas that may be coming in the future, knowing that Garden Del Mar is actually slated for the east side of the street, and knowing that they may have some improvements, and knowing that they will be looking at adding parking and streetscape and landscape in this area, we are still showing bulb outs, and this is the new 10th Street mid-block crossing. And we're also noticing that, there's the big vacant parcel, that there's a large retaining wall that's got a pretty narrow sidewalk here, and thinking, maybe we would soften it up with some new landscaping, some new trees, try to widen that sidewalk as much as possible. But we're not looking at kind of doing widening for parking or anything at this location, because you'd really have to rebuild that whole entire retaining wall, which would get pretty costly and pretty expensive, and it's something that probably would happen with whoever may, acquire that parcel or try to develop it. That would be conditioned to sort of provide parking in the streetscape, so it's something you'd want to try to do as part of the redevelopment of this block. And then also looking at the other sort of crossings. And from there, we've also started to use 3D to actually start to say, what does this actually look like if you're not just looking at it, from top-down view or in plan view. And this is a tool that we'll actually be utilizing, that as we bring back sort of preferred plans, we'll be able to develop this, and it'll be a model you can sort of spin around real time. But it's kind of a nice, powerful tool to say, are we liking the way the geometries and the way that things are starting to lay out? So this is just looking at existing conditions, and this is actually at 11th Street, so we kind of built a model block just to show. And saying in concept A, if we start making the improvements that we're showing, it potentially will start to look like this with the additional trees, the bulb outs, the material changes. And then looking at concept B, if we're looking at material changes, it start to take on a little bit different quality. You're starting to see the opportunity zones come where you get the wider sidewalks. The next angle just sort of drops down and looks at the same intersection, but from a pedestrian level, that you start to see the improvements that kind of quickly could be made. And we've got a board that actually has a lot of these out here for a block by block out here. We can dive into these in more detail, but it's just kind of a nice tool that will help people visualize what kind of improvements we're really looking at for these various areas. And then again, looking at it sort of down the street corridor and saying what happens in option B, and then looking at option A and option B, where you now start to see some of the wider sidewalks additional landscaping, etc. We're not really hinting at plant material or anything in this. We're just using sort of generic symbols for it, but we'll be much more specific and we'll be able to kind of dial into what that's looking like as we move forward. And then flipping around and looking the other way, looking southbound at the 12th Street intersection, looking at existing conditions and concept A and concept B. And you're seeing, opportunities for more sidewalk cafe zones. And not saying that, it's going to necessarily be in there in day one, but it's kind of a wider area that could potentially see that in the future. And then looking at the same corner down from pedestrian level or eye experience that, by doing some of these improvements, there's just much more opportunity for improvements in areas. And with that, the kind of next steps, this is the last slide we have, and then we'll open up to questions, be able to, go out and look at the boards. I think there's a questionnaire that everybody's got that we've been trying to follow through. We've got questions that we'd like to get feedback on, but ask questions, make sure you're understanding things. And any comments that are open-ended, we love any sort of feedback, Are there also things that are missing in the plans, things you really don't like, things that are there? Yes.
Do you have any photos of actual real photos of other towns that have the different materials, like in a pedestrian crosswalk, to see what that looks like?
Yeah, we've got a couple photos that show up in like the art areas. Oh, yeah. Sorry, the question actually for those on TV was, are there photo examples of what other cities have been doing for sort of material changes or decorative crosswalks or other items? And we've got some material boards. The art board actually had a few of them, but as we look at these later, we can show you some different things that people are doing art, people are doing, brick, they are doing pavers, they are doing concrete. So there's a lot of different opportunities for this, and we have them on the boards. I can probably go back to it as well too, and we can look at it in a little bit. And just to finish up, I think this is my last slide, and then we can go back to that. Where we're headed from tonight is we're really trying to get all that outreach, or all this feedback from these outreach events and meetings. We've been still collecting that and trying to see what our fatal flaws are, what's missing in the concept plans, what do people like, what people don't like, and where we should be heading. And then our next step after that is really taking all this feedback and really diving into the really fine-grained detail, identifying like every single little sign and utility box, and really trying to say what all staying, what's all going, what needs to be relocated, what's the grading looking like. And we'll be taking this to actually sort of develop our sort of conceptual 30% level plans. We'll be bringing back to council in September. Also be doing additional coordination with the design guidelines and then the complete streets and green streets policy that the city is undertaking right now as well too, just to make sure that we're all in agreement. There's all these planning efforts that are happening. We want to make sure that the left hand is talking to the right hand or whatever. I'm probably mixing my phrase there. And then looking for planning level cost estimates. What is this going to cost? Just so we can start budgeting or allocating money or thinking about what's concept A potentially cost or what's concept B cost, so that we can probably talk about that. And then starting to look at what potential phasing might actually move us toward this phase one improvements, but what also might help us move toward concept B if that is the long-term vision for this that we end up with. And then our final deliverables that we'll actually be presenting out of this in September will be this conceptual streetscape plan that'll be this sort of phase one thing that you'll really be the pieces you'll start to see go in January. And then we'll also be doing an addendum to the 1996 plan, which will really be the long-term vision. What is the sort of big plan? Where do we really want to get with the streetscape if we're a few more years out? And how do we sort of get to implementing that? What's it cost? What are the policies that need to happen to get there? And with that, I believe that concludes my slides. I can go back and quickly kind of talk about the material changes here. It might take a little while to get back there, but I'll try to go fast here. It's a little hard to see, but these are some examples of some decorative concrete. So this is actually a glass that's been seeded into the concrete, and actually has some other concrete with an integral color. I know it's just a little thumbnail. The other one that was here is actually a painted mural that actually is happening in a crosswalk. And there's another board outside that actually shows that you could actually just use brick or another type of concrete or something like that actually would be used in the crosswalks, or you could use it in the whole entire intersection. There's options. It doesn't have to necessarily be confined to just the crosswalk. It could be a much bigger piece as well too. Yeah.
All right. Now, I think the streetscape and everything is looking really great, but when I drive through Del Mar, I always notice these shops and stores and restaurants. The buildings look so old, and then we have a pretty street, but we have these old shops. You alluded to that ugly, empty lot that's been there forever. Is there any plans to upgrade that? Because you drive down a pretty street, but you see these old shops you don't really want to stop and go into. And as a comparison, Encinitas has been, I mean, revitalized with some beautiful storefronts and everything. Is there any ability, plans to not just have the street be pretty, but also the buildings that are on the street?
Yeah. If you want to talk, that's.
So I think that's a great question, and somebody brought that up the other night at our pop-up booth too. And it's I think the private buildings, it's private property, and there's kind of takes a set of tools to address the whole corridor. So this is one component of it, looking at the streetscape. It's mainly focused on the areas that the city can control. But then in addition, that's where you continue to look at what other tools do you need to encourage a private property to make changes. We do actually have a couple of development projects pending in the downtown area. And my experience from working in other cities is sometimes those become a Kickstarter for other projects, for other properties to invest and reinvest. Similarly, our Business Support Advisory Committee has been talking about the idea of a facade improvement program. It hasn't been discussed at the city council level, but if that were to proceed, that might be a tool that a private property might use a matching fund grant to then invest in their property. Or we're working on the design guidelines. It's mostly focused on residential, but there is a chapter on commercial. And then those would be, as private properties were changing, a set of guidelines that they would use to be consistent with the Streetscape project as well. So I guess my short answer is that it takes a series of tools, different tools in the toolbox, to get to the ultimate long-term vision, and this is one component of that.
I could then follow up and ask, will it be easier for businesses to actually open a new restaurant? Because when you talk to some of the businesses that have come, like a tasting room and, the new brewery, is it going to be easier? Because they always talk about the arduous process they have to go through. It takes years and years to get approved.
So again, thinking about it from a series of tools in our toolbox, and there's in our city we have our municipal code that speaks to what the parking requirements are for different types of business or whatever the process might be. So that has been an ongoing conversation at the Business Support Advisory Committee and a city council, and I think that those conversations would continue. This project by itself doesn't take on that, but it becomes part of an overall equation of, how do you get to that long-term goal of what the community wants to see for the downtown? So we don't just start this and, do the work between January and May and it's all done magically like everybody wants it to be. You have to keep working on it through different avenues to get to that long-term vision.
Any additional questions? Yeah, I'd probably pass the mic back.
What are some of the proposed trees you're considering?
Yeah, so there's actually a street tree plan guidelines. So we're wanting to make sure that we're following in accordance with that. But one of the things we know there are some of the big character defining trees are actually the Torrey pines and the Monterey cypress. We're not proposing wholesale sort of planting of those, but want to make sure that we're sort of keeping those or using those where appropriate. But then also looking at like Arbutus marina, which is the strawberry tree, looking at like Tipuana tipu, which is the tipu tree. Also looking at sort of smaller scale trees that are like flowering and will provide more pedestrian scale and interest, like crepe myrtles or western red buds. So there's still quite a few things on the table that we haven't quite dove into those details, but those are the items that we're starting to look at. And knowing we're trying to really balance sort of carbon sequestration, which is what the cypress and the Torrey pines do a lot of heavy lifting and do the most for carbon sequestration, and actually really for a lot stormwater management. So that's there's some really good value with those. And wanting to make sure that they are sort of the trees that are Del Mar, and they do have that the Torrey pines are native here. We want to make sure we're highlighting that, but we also want to use trees that are much more sort of appropriate, specifically along the sidewalks. Saying that the pines and cypress might be more appropriate for the medians, and that might also be where you start to see the strawberry trees or the tipus because they're more sort of stately. They tend to branch out and sort of reach out over the sort of travel lanes without being they're high branch too, so they're not going to cause conflicts with bus or trucks or other items like that. So we're kind of looking at it holistically, but those are kind of where we've been heading with the trees. And thinking about these actually tie in nicely with the trees that have been proposed for the City Hall and Civic Center. We are using some of those trees along the streetscape as well too. But thinking that we want to kind of look at it holistically and what is kind of the theme and creating a framework. Not saying we want to use the same street tree the whole entire length of the duration, but we want to try to create that interest. And that's what we've kind of heard from a lot of people is that ability to sort of change and have character sort of develop, that there's areas or zones that are, garden zones and more urban zones and more that we really want to sort of play off of that as well too.
do some of those things that you were asking for feedback on?
Yeah, sure.
You touched on a lot of things you said you wanted to hear from us, and is this the opportunity, or is it some other time?
Yeah, we've also included all these in the survey that were definitely things that we wanted to hear back from as well too. So that's also another place that we're also collecting these. And Kristen has the questionnaires or the forms if people didn't get one on their way in. And so we would also want them in that, but if there's anything, I guess, without sort of diving into every single one or whatever you want to talk about, we could also talk afterwards as well too, if that's easier. But yeah, we do want to hear back on anything and everything. And, you know, if there's stuff that's missing just because we didn't say we didn't want to hear on it, you know, we do want to hear about anything that, you know, maybe we didn't cover as well too. So, yeah. Like they're passing the microphone up too.
So I have a question. One of the things about Del Mar, it's a very unique place. We have a great history to Del Mar. And looking at your streetscape and looking at what you're doing, it'd be really great to incorporate plaques that have something to do with the history, with the track, with the various different movie stars that used to live here, the plunge, the pier. These are all parts of this town that are unique. And it would be nice, since we want to get people to walk, that they have a destination. So not just stores and restaurants, but hey, this is a nice little seating area. Let's read about, like at the corner of 10th Street, that down at the end there used to be a plunge and what was there and that history.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea and great comment. Thanks for bringing it up. I think that that's something we would definitely want to look at, as are there opportunities to do that. So I know DMVA has actually started collecting a list of that and actually has talked about that as well too in the past, that they've been thinking about it. So I think that that is something that we would want to collaborate and work with them on too. But yeah, thanks for the comment on that. I think we would want to do that because it would be something that would be a draw to bring people here and actually get people to use the corridor or utilize it. So thank you for that.
I just want to go back to the bike lanes. I think either concept A or B should be painted green. And the idea of having a raised or textured white line between the cars and the bikes, I think should be implemented.
Okay.
It would be very, very helpful for everybody.
Great. Thank you for that.
Yeah, overall, I really appreciate all your hard work and the plan. My comment is regarding the medians and the pedestrian refuge areas. Is there any way or any thought that you could put into transferring that space more towards the sidewalks to make it more of a pedestrian-oriented thing? I just get the feeling that people aren't going to be hanging out in those, particularly at the 13th crossing. You know, on the east side, we're still staying with a 5-foot sidewalk, and that's not really what the community plan wants. It may want I think, a more pedestrian-friendly atmosphere, if possible.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. It's sort of the trade-off of what, you know, where is the safe sort of median or refuge area. So we are getting those extra 4 feet by taking it out of the travel lane. And we've been talking about, you know, is there potential to even, you know, look at getting an additional foot, like by having a 9-foot travel lane and a 10-foot travel lane, or could we go to 9.5-foot travel lanes to get some additional space? So I think we're still kind of exploring that, but wanting to make sure that if we are creating a sort of balancing the need to put stuff back into the sidewalk versus putting stuff into the refuge areas. And I think that there are a few areas definitely where you're mentioning that we are pretty tight if we especially go with like a concept A where we're only getting 5 feet. And it maybe is a little bit more of a sort of short-term solution, but thinking that, you know, if we are in a lot of the other areas, we really can find sort of up to 10 feet, which is a pretty wide sidewalk zone. But I think that we'd want to definitely talk about that. You know, where is the trade-off? What do people feel? How do people feel about the refuge island? Would they rather see it, you know, on the sidewalks? Would people rather see it in the medians? And, you know, thinking about what is kind of the appropriate.
I guess I'm
distance.
saying I'd rather see it on the sidewalks.
Yeah. So I think I'm hearing that from you. I guess I'd
sidewalks.
be curious to see what others think about that idea too.
It's not on your survey. So
Yeah.
survey says here.
Yeah, there's a section at the bottom that are sort of other comments, and definitely write that in there. I'd love to hear what other people kind of think about that too, if you know, have an opinion on that, of trade-off versus sort of a median refuge island area versus kind of wider sidewalks.
Other questions?
Yeah.
How much of this can we expect to see in phase 1?
Yeah, so we're still working through a lot of those details. Concept A seems closer to what we'll probably end up seeing as part of phase one. If there are potential to take advantage of some of the opportunity zones, if we can actually work out negotiations with property owners, or there are areas we're talking like the area in front of like Lemon Tree Corner or the corner of Matus where we're really trying to get those sidewalks in there. You might start to see some of those things that are showing up in sort of concept B actually take full advantage of those in this phase one. It's kind of still determined on budget and how much we can actually sort of get in there, but concept A is probably closer with any items from concept B, like green striping of bike lanes is something that, could be done in either concept. Even as we're looking at, additional sort of, I'm trying to think here, the turn pockets could potentially work their way into, phase one if we decided that we wanted to get rid of turn pockets. That's a much more radical example, but also thinking that, even like the scramble crosswalk or some of the public art or some of these accent or paving patterns. So it's really kind of looking for some of that feedback, because some of these things are easier to do than others, but if there's anything that you feel really important about being sort of in a phase one, we definitely would like to hear that too.
Okay, so are you saying that concept A is phase one?
Not necessarily. It's probably closer to concept one. We're still working through all those details.
Okay.
And as we start looking at cost and, how long it might take to actually construct some of these things, like if we start, tearing up a lot of curb and a lot of roadway, we might not actually be able to do that in the sort of first 5-month phase. So there's still a lot of things in play here, but it's probably closer to concept A, but there's still some movement in that. It's not necessarily just concept A that's phase one, but there could be some things that will take longer. There could be some things in concept B that can be included in this phase one. So it's open-ended still a little bit at this point.
And when would phase two be starting?
The sort of to be determined as well too. We'll be looking at that as we're talking about phasing strategies and talking about that as we come back to council in September as well too. I think the hope would be to sort of continuously, do this if funding is available in that January to May timeframe. So it could be as early as 19 if funding and sort of the resources and there's a big enough project to sort of bite off if some of the longer term policy things are there. But that's all kind of to be determined, to be pending. So we'll really need to have some of those conversations to figure out what's possible.
What are the funding options? So, say the question is, what are the funding options?
Yeah. The ones that we've been looking at, there might be others that I'm not really aware of, not knowing exactly what all the pockets of money are or pools of money. But I know that there's capital improvement funds that there will be budgets set aside for that. The Major Q money that was recently passed, the sales tax, there's potential funding from that as well too coming down the road. Are there others? I'm not sure if I think that's pretty much covers it.
So that'll be a policy question for the city council to figure that out.
So one of the things that I've noticed when you drive either way on Camino del Mar right now is that the planting in the median is very high. So it really is cutting off visibility. So when you're looking at the planting to put in the median, are you looking at low planting so people can see the entire street as they drive by, while it just adds interest and color, but not blocking views?
Yeah, correct. Actually, we heard that comment a lot, and actually we didn't dive into that didn't mention it here, but we heard a lot of conversation about how the existing natal plum and the Raphiolipus is really too high. It's more of a visual barrier and a blockage. So we're really looking at things, and kind of the standards are 30 inches or lower is where you really want to be if you want that visibility, and we'll probably be looking at that 30-inch mark and things that are under 30 inches, possibly even sort of as low as 24 and lower. But that's what we're shooting for, to really keep that much more open and visible.
Great.
Not really a question. I just want to throw in a vote for bike safety. I think
Sure.
Del Mar right now, when you bike past Starbucks, for example, cars pull in and out and park, and it can be really chaotic there. So I really appreciate the painted bike lanes. I think it's great, and anything that can prevent cars from going into them. And I also would advocate bike parking, and maybe instead of micro vehicles or motorcycles, to maybe make Del Mar sort of a bike-friendly town. There are a lot of bikes that pass through the city on weekends, and it could attract people to stop here and hang out at cafes and so on. I think it could be a good community to attract. That's an area where I feel Encinitas is failing. When you actually bike through Encinitas, you have to go on the inside streets because it's so dangerous to bike through it. So that's an area I really think, I think this looks great. And
Yeah.
I was in Palo Alto recently. They had these bright bike lanes, and it's very attractive. I mean, I think it's at least for biking,
Great.
and bikes are attractive as well. They don't make a lot of noise and so on, and
And-
I just want to throw in a vote for that.
Thank you. And I'll just say that one thing that we are looking at too, that it's very, very subtle, but we'll be working with the transportation engineers, and we've been looking at it even in our plans, but you start to see like the breaks that occur in the bike lanes. We're starting to include that in our plan where there are sort of conflicts with, pedestrians, or there's sort of a warning where the bike lane breaks. You see the little stripes, and we'd be looking at doing that at any driveway where there might be sort of the ability to sort of say, hey, there might be cars coming in, alerts both the biker that, look out for the cars, but it also alerts the cars that it's not solid here. You're pulling out into a bike lane. So it's kind of a subtle improvement, but something we've been looking at in our plans as well too. But thank you. Yeah.
I would just like to say, as far as the left turn pockets, I would like to see them retained.
Okay.
We have a lot of tourists in this town that are driving around looking for things, and they have no idea where they are and what they're doing and where they're going. And they need to be able to be in a defined lane, which will then at least let the rest of us know that they think their intention is to make a left turn or a U-turn, because we can't second guess, and there's just not a good consistent traffic flow because of all the visitors. And I think retaining those left turn pockets is extremely important. I also don't want to be sitting in traffic stacking up while my car is idling, and we may have wonderful trees, but I think from an environmental standpoint, the traffic needs to be able to flow. It can't just be stopped, and it's because of the left turn pockets is one of the reasons it might be happening.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other comments and questions? Okay. So I just would want to thank everyone for coming, and we really appreciate all the constructive feedback. The survey questionnaire that hopefully you all received. I know there's a lot of questions and details, but we're at a point in the project that Brad and his team really need this level of feedback from the community to help them in shaping what we bring forward as a recommendation. We have some displays outside and would be happy to talk with you more detail about any particular locations or particular questions. And so thanks again for spending your evening. Oh, here.